Thank you so much. I've never walked on stage to applause to talk, so this is absolutely fantastic. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for coming, for taking the time to be in this space this evening. A big thank you to the American Musicological Society, to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and to my new family, my new home, the Oakland Symphony, for their work in organizing this talk, this conversation, this exploration of orchestrating Blackness. This is a conversation that has been years in the works for me personally, and I'm so excited to take you all on the journey that I have been going on personally through the music of Irene Britton Smith and Julia Perry. Before we get into the thick of things this evening, I want to start with music. This hour-long conversation is going to be sort of a survey into the music of these two composers as I give some context to their life and sort of the social things that are happening in their world as they're writing. So I'd like to start the evening off with a piece by Irene Britton Smith, her Passacaglia in Fugue in C-sharp minor, a piece that she wrote in 1940. And I'm so grateful that we have some students from the conservatory who are going to be playing some of these pieces, particularly by Irene Britton Smith, for us this evening. So if you would please help me welcome John Lee to the stage, who will be performing the Passacaglia in Fugue in C-sharp minor by Irene Britton Smith. Thank you. So I want to start with a question for the room. How many of you, before coming to this event, had never heard of Irene Britton Smith? Fantastic. How many of you had never heard of Julia Perry? Amazing. This checks out because in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, as many of us were sitting at home thinking about our lives, and especially for many of us who were reconciling with the social unrest and what was going on in the world around us, I personally had this conniption that I had a gap in my music education. There was an absence of black composers in what I knew at that time in the world. This quote that I put up here is a quote that I was living in Chicago at the time, and many of my friends were thinking about this specific quote and thinking about this work, and it reads, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time, but if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." This is a mural that actually a friend of mine did on another friend's garage. And in this conversation, I had to reconcile the fact that after studying classical music for about 7 years at that point, going to a performing arts high school, going to a conservatory for my undergraduate degree, several years of intensives, summer music intensives, I had never played a piece by a black composer, had never studied a black composer, didn't really know many black composers at the time. So with all of the sort of social conversations that I was dealing with personally and the conversation that classical music was having at the time, I decided to do some Googling. I went to Google and I typed in black composers, something as simple as that. And then I typed in black female composers because I wanted to know who was out there. I started to find names like Florence Price and Samuel Coleridge Taylor and Margaret Bonds and composers that I never really had growing up. There was a piece by Julia Perry, who that research, a piece that she wrote for piano, her prelude for piano that she wrote in 1946. This is one of her earliest pieces that we have, and as an amateur pianist, I won't dare go over to that piano and try to play, but as an amateur pianist, I sat at my little keyboard in my condo and played this piece over and over again. Not only was it a piece by a black female composer, but sonically, harmonically, there was something about it that truly grasped me and changed my life and changed how I thought about music. It's such a short piece that I want to play it all for you and transport you back to where I was in 2020, having never experienced black female composers, to discovering this piece by Julia Perry. Sitting in my apartment, listening to this, playing this piece, there was something that grasped me immediately. This music was unlike anything that I perceived black composers were supposed to be writing, should be writing, right? There was no inherent trace of the spiritual. There was no inherent trace of these musical idioms that we connect to black music. But somehow, in this piece of Julia Perry, there was something that still felt black, right? There was something in her harmonic language, the way that she used sevenths and ninths, the syncopation in her rhythms, this sort of lazy triplet feel that transported me back to something that I knew. But on the surface, when I would play this piece for people and say, can you guess who wrote this piece? Many people would never suspect that it was a black female composer. I wanted more of this. I played this piece over and over again, and I wanted more of her music. And sadly, I found out that much of the music of Julia Perry, much of the music of Irene Britton Smith had not been published. It hadn't been performed. It hadn't been recorded. This music was stuck in archives, waiting to be unearthed. And one of the archives that this music landed in is the Helen Walker Hill collection at the University of Colorado Boulder, which I ended up doing my master's degree at this school, finishing last summer. In this archive, Helen Walker Hill, who was married to George Walker, a black composer, one of the first black composers to be awarded a Pulitzer Prize for composition. Helen Walker Hill was teaching piano and composition and musicology at the University of Colorado Boulder, and took it upon herself in that time to move her students forward and wanted pieces for her students to perform. So she started calling up all of these black female composers that she knew through George Walker and getting their music from them. She discovers in that journey that there's a treasure trove of music from these black female composers that no one is paying attention to, so it all gets put in the Helen Walker Hill collection at the University of Colorado Boulder. In 2020, as a conductor, I want to program this music. I want to program it with orchestras. I want people to know this music. But I come across this idea and this fact that much of the music is not accessible. It's not been published. No one's selling it. No one's renting it. So I pack up my bags. I leave Chicago. I move to Colorado, and I set out to study this work and to invest, along with so many other people in my community, in doing the work of uncovering the works of black female composers. So, who is Julia Perry? Who is Irene Britton Smith? I'd love to give a little background into these women, sort of a brief resume. I'll start with this interview quote from Julia Perry, such a phenomenal woman who I've gotten to know more about in studying. This interview comes from the Christian Science magazine in 1949. This is at a time where Julia Perry is starting to do and has been doing a lot of international travel. Her career as a composer, as a conductor, as a singer is starting to blossom. And she says, "Music is an all-embracing universal language. Music has a unifying effect on the peoples of the world because they all understand and love it. In music, they find a common meeting ground. And when they find themselves enjoying and loving the same music, they find themselves loving one another. Music has a great role to play in establishing the brotherhood of man." So Julia Perry is born in 1924 in Lexington, Kentucky, and she grows up in Akron, Ohio. She's a singer, she's a composer, she's a teacher, she's a conductor, she does it all. She gets her bachelor's and her master's degree from Westminster Choir College, and then goes on to study at the Tanglewood Music Festival. She studies choral conducting with Hugh Ross and composition with Luigi Dalla Piccola. And then she travels to Paris studying with Nadia Boulanger. She is one of the American composers who studies in Paris with Nadia Boulanger, and she continues her study in Italy with Luigi Dalla Piccola. She gets 2 Guggenheim fellowships and multiple tours sponsored by the U.S. Information Service, doing European concert tours both as a conductor and as a singer. She travels for so long having this robust career, and sadly, by the 1960s, this career takes a halt. She's no longer traveling. She's back in Akron. She's teaching, but she's composing feverishly. She completes over 10 symphonies, 2 operas, piano concertos, violin concertos, chamber music, and on and on. Again, most of these pieces have never been heard. In 1970, she suffers a stroke that paralyzes the right side of her body, and this does not stop her. She retrains herself to use her left hand, and she continues writing music until her death in 1979. By her death, no one is playing her music. She's writing to conductors like Claudio Abbado and Zubin Mehta and Paul Freeman and George Solti, trying to find someone to give her music a chance, and sadly, nothing. She dies, like I said, in 1979, and up until the last 2 to 3 years, no one knew this name, no one knew this music, and it sat unperformed for many years. I want to turn us to another piece of music, the Stabat Mater that Julia Perry writes in 1951. This is a piece that she writes for mezzo and strings, and it's a piece that actually launches her career internationally. She tours Europe singing and conducting in this work that she writes, the Stabat Mater. Musical America writes about the Italian premiere that Miss Perry has a great gift for the setting of words to music and a delicate sense of the meaning of the Latin text. She shows a thorough technical knowledge, and one could readily forgive the extraneous contemporary influences. Exactly, that's exactly right. So you can imagine in 1951 and in the 50s and 60s, this battle that's happening with all contemporary composers, all 20th century composers, of how to leverage their musical language with what's going on in the paradigm. So I want to play just a little brief clip of the middle movements of the Stabat Mater. This is a piece that spans 16 minutes in multiple sections, 10 sections. But here's a middle section just so you can get a sense of the modernist techniques and styles that Julia Perry uses. A great writer and musicologist says about Julia Perry writing this piece, a piece that she dedicates to her mother, that while there are no black idioms evident in this music, you can feel the struggle and the pain of black mothers as they're reconciling with what they're dealing with in that time. And I truly believe you can hear that in this, her Stabat Mater. This music is diabolical. It's lyrical, it's expressive, it's expansive, it's so many things. The first time I heard this piece, I was gobsmacked at the fact that no one at that time in 2020, when I was starting to do this work, no one was performing this music, right? This was one of the only recordings of it that was out there, and it was such a shame to me that someone with such a clear artistic voice had been left to the side for so long. I just saw recently that this piece was performed at the LA Philharmonic, so I'm very, very, very excited that even in the last 3 years that a name like Julia Perry in a piece like this is getting the much needed recognition that it deserves. Irene Britton Smith is a very different figure and very different person than Julia Perry, and I position them together because their music and the research for me is so connected in who they were and where they were and how they were writing. This poem by Irene Britton Smith is something that has been so dear to me in my learning about her. Other than being an amazing composer and teacher, she was an avid poet, and when I visited Chicago and Colorado for her archives, I could find all of these sketches of poems that she would write even on the sketches of her music. So this is a poem that she writes in 1947. Sometimes I say I am limited. I will never be able to write my song. Then from within a voice reminds me that this is wrong. I must not think of limitations. If I would achieve this goal, he will impart the notes and I will write his song. Irene Britton Smith, who is deeply religious and deeply devout in her religious beliefs, but also in her dedication to the craft of music. So a little bit about Irene Britton Smith. She spans pretty much all of the 20th century. It's really incredible. She's born in 1907 in Chicago. She studied piano and violin as a child. And unlike Julia Perry, Irene Britton Smith never considered herself a composer. She worked as a public school teacher in the Chicago public school system for 40 years of her life. That was her career. That was her profession. She considered herself to be a music educator. And it wasn't until 1937 that we have her first piece of music that she writes. This is well into her professional career. She's teaching in music schools, but she has this passion for composition that ignites within her. And in the mid-40s, she begins studying composition seriously. She takes sabbaticals off from teaching, and she goes to the American Conservatory of Music. She takes sabbatical off. She goes to Juilliard and Eastman and the Tanglewood Music Festival, where in 1949, she meets Julia Perry. This image is actually taken by Irene Britton Smith at the Tanglewood Music Festival in 1949, where they were there studying together. Julia Perry at that time studying choral conducting, and Irene Britton Smith studying composition. Irene Britton Smith had this tenacious spirit and thirst for composition that led her to get her master's degree in composition from DePaul in 1956. And it is in 1956 at DePaul that she writes a sinfonietta, a 3-movement work for orchestra that is a part of her master's thesis project that never was performed. The piece never was written. When I went to Chicago, I took out the manuscript score and the manuscript parts freshly, and Irene Britton Smith actually writes about this in the book that Helen Walker Hill published, that one of the biggest disappointments of her life is that she never got to hear her sinfonietta before she passed away. By 1962, she stops composing altogether. And by 1989, she retires and becomes a docent for the Chicago Symphony before passing away in 1999. So she has a very different career and a very different approach to composition. But as we hear in the Passacaglia earlier, there is definitely a skill, a craft that she has, an ear that she has for composition. We're going to turn to another piece of live music and invite two more conservatory students to perform a piece from a song cycle that Irene Britton Smith wrote. I put this poem up here and talk about her poetry because this idea of setting text is very dear to Irene Britton Smith's heart. And the piece that you will hear now is the final movement, the final song in a song cycle she writes entitled Dream Cycle. And this dream cycle sets the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar. So I'd like you all to help me welcome Morgan Wolfe, soprano, and Donald Lee, piano, as they perform the final movement of Irene Britton Smith's Dream Cycle, Why Fades a Dream. So I'd like to look very briefly at some of the musical traits of their music. And this is, for me, very hard to quantify because part of my whole work in doing this is to say that Black composers do not compose under a monolith. They are expansive and they do all things, but just a couple of aesthetic things that we see really I think, a part of all 20th century composers of that time that they're dealing with. One of the biggest things that drew me to Irene Britton Smith and Julia Perry in the beginning was this idea of an independent aesthetic. It was the fact that when I listened to Julia Perry, when I listened to the Prelude for Piano or the Stabat Mater, it didn't sound like anything that I had ever heard coming out of classical music, particularly coming out of black female composers or even black composers. The same with Irene Britton Smith. It was something that was completely new and different. And I think this is very important for black composers of the 20th century trying to navigate how to write music that represents their cultural background, but also that is reflective of the music that they are studying, the traditions of classical music. We get this idea of dissonant or expansive harmonic structures, right? This use of sevenths and ninths and seconds and things that are crunchy and things that are expansive, even in Why Phase a Dream. It's never dissonant, but it is dreamlike almost. Complex rhythms. And every composer is writing with complex rhythms in the 20th century, right? We know what Stravinsky is doing, we know what Bartók is doing, but what's fascinating for me about Irene Britton Smith and Julia Perry, particularly Irene Britton Smith and her later works, is that the complex rhythms of, it's where they originate from. We get complex rhythms that are rooted in African traditions, that are rooted in Latinx traditions, right? They're branching all of these cultural traditions and the compositional technique of their European training. And finally, this idea of vertical versus horizontal textures. There's a piece by Julia Perry that we'll listen to later where this is really a big trait. We see that they're deciding how to use and how to write for the orchestra. It goes between moments that are very sort of horizontal, that are very chordal, that are very harmonic, and moments where the theme and the idea of writing is about stacking and layer vertical lines on top of on top of each other without really an emphasis on the harmonic structure. However, this is not a one-size-fits-all narrative. I could throw a giant word, a map of characteristics of their music that we find throughout their outputs, because, like I like to say, black music is not a monolith, right? All of these composers are engaging their spiritual backgrounds, their cultural backgrounds, their religious backgrounds, their racial backgrounds, and combining that with their training and aesthetics in music. They are being innovative while also being the bearers of culture for where they stand. This musical and sonic influence comes from social conversations that are happening in the black community at the time that I want to briefly highlight. There are two big thought leaders in the early 20th century, many thought leaders in the 20th century, but for the sake of today, two in particular that really kind of embody this tension that black Americans are dealing with in the 20th century that seeps into the musical language. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois had varying ideas about the future as it was related for black Americans, and this even related to music. How should black music sound as we were liberated and moved forward in the American context? Booker T. Washington, took a stance that was rooted in black practicality and survival, this idea of remaining separate and building practical wealth within black communities. He wasn't interested in status or this idea that black people should rise to be like their white counterparts, but that they should build something that was uniquely theirs. W.E.B. Du Bois continued to advocate for a first-class citizenship that had no boundaries, that was expansive and that was rooted in exceptionalism. This idea for black Americans to travel, to be educated, and to be first-class citizens like their white counterparts. W.E.B. Du Bois, there's a quote that he talks about the double consciousness of black Americans, this experience in which one feels their two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This tension is felt throughout the Black community in the early and mid 20th century, and it's felt deeply within Black composers of the 20th century. We see this lived out in this sort of dichotomy that we talk about between the Florence Prices and the Margaret Bonds, who are writing in a cultural context that is deeply rooted in the Black tradition and popular music of the Black tradition, juxtaposed, for lack of better words, with the music of Irene Britton Smith, of Julia Perry, of Ollie Wilson, of George Walker, of those who are expanding the landscape of how Black composers are perceived. But even within Julia Perry, we see this dichotomy lived out. As she sets spirituals, as she writes songs for her church choir, they're deeply rooted in the spiritual and they're deeply rooted in this cultural upbringing. I want to share one of these spiritual settings by Julia Perry, her setting of I'm a Poor Little Orphan. And think about the Stabat Mater that we listened to earlier, this piece that is so rich and so dense with pain, setting the text of the Stabat Mater. And here in turn, Julia Perry uses a voice and piano and creates a very different setting that to me evokes this same idea of yearning, of longing, of hope, of despair as she sets the spiritual that is beautifully sung by Shirley Verrett in this recording. Very different writing, but still very powerful. One of the biggest things that I love about this piece, and something we talked about earlier with this idea of vertical versus horizontal writing. And in each setting of this, you know, the first and third verses, you get this very simple chordal writing. And then in the middle, as almost to set the text and emphasis of being a poor little orphan, there's one single piano line that accompanies the voice. And this idea of black women using very little and creating a lot is something that I find in the compositional writing, particularly of Irene Britton Smith and Julia Perry. It's very little musical material that they use to create completely captivating sonic worlds, which is so absolutely beautiful and breathtaking. I want to highlight two black musicologists who've come before me and who've done a lot of work in this conversation around black music and what black music sounds like, and creating a much broader definition of black music. The first quote comes from Eileen Southern, who lives around the same time and in the same time period as Julia Perry and Irene Britton Smith, and she writes that the black American composer of art music is constantly being confronted with the problem of what kind of music to write. All of their training prepares them to write in the European tradition, but their lifestyle often leads them to find deeper meaning in their people. This highlights the idea that black composers at that time were trying their best to reconcile their cultural identity with the art that they created, right? This wasn't an easy conversation for them to have at that time and to reconcile how to write music and how to be a part of their communities, but they're studying abroad, they're traveling, they're having so much more opportunities to expand. Black composers at this time are studying at prestigious music institutions and abroad, and they're taking the chances to study with influential European-trained composers. And Southern notes that for the first time in history, a generation of black composers has moved into the professional world in the same way that their white counterparts do. So how does this change the landscape of the music that comes out of this generation of black composers? Guthrie P. Ramsey Jr., who's also a musicologist, writes about this as well in an article called Afro-Modernists and Music, and he writes that, and while a common vocabulary or grammar is not even desirable among black composers, a new and highly desirable consensus of positive and assertive attitudes is clearly emerging. The question of a year ago, most often concerning which musical sounds and materials would be necessary to make black music, are no longer necessary. We know that because we are black, we are making black music, and we hear it too. Guthrie P. Ramsey is also a jazz musician, and jazz music, I did a panel a few days ago talking about the connections of jazz and classical music, and I would be remiss not to mention the connection that happens in the mid-20th century as jazz musicians are Europe, and their musical styles are changing. We have composers like John and Alice Coltrane and Mary Lou Williams and so many more who are in Paris and in Europe, and they're traveling and they're touring and they're listening to the sounds of 20th century composers, and they're being influenced, and jazz music is starting to expand into free jazz and contemporary jazz and experimental jazz. So how does that conversation of jazz composers in that time reflect on the classical composers who are also in Europe, who are also having those same juxtaposing experiences? This idea of juxtaposing the science of technically demanding music with the magic of spirituality with the goal of healing and building a community. There's this idea that these composers are now reaching from a well of influences as they create their music. And Guthrie P. Ramsey so beautifully says it as I feel it. We know that because we are black, we are making black music, and we hear it too. So where does this leave us? Where does this leave us now? What are the trends? What is classical music doing now? As a conductor, I can sit here and think about the theory and the history, but at the end of the day, we must program, and we must think about how this is reflected. These numbers that we see come from the Doan Women in Music organization in their 2023-2024 orchestral report surveying over 100 orchestras worldwide. These numbers are in comparison to 2 years ago, a research that they did in 2021-2022, and we see between these two years of reporting that the women worldwide composers have decreased in their performance from 7.7 to 7.5%. In the global majority women, that number has dropped from 2.1 to 1.6. and black female composers declined from 1.02 to 0.59. This is the fear that I had in 2020 as I was sitting at home thinking about these composers and seeing the resurgence that was happening, knowing that in the 60s, in the 50s, in the 40s, that there was this landscape of black composers, of black contemporary composers, of black modern composers who were being commissioned by Chicago, by Pittsburgh, by LA, by all of these orchestras. But by the time I came around and I'm studying in school, I knew none of them. And in this resurgence we saw in 2020 and 2021 and 2022, as all of these orchestras were programming music by black composers, by black female composers, there was this excitement and this energy. But according to this research, that number is sadly dwindling. So what are some of the things that are causing that? What are some of the things that are playing a part of this conversation? Cultural familiarity, right? The idea that programmers and decision makers often gravitate towards works that resonate with their own cultural experiences, overlooking diverse perspectives. And we see this happening even within the context of black composers. Florence Price's name shows up more times than Julia Perry because of the cultural familiarity with the sonic qualities of her music. Audience expectation, right? This idea of what will our audiences love? What will they program? How does this trip us up? The perception that culturally identifiable works are more relatable and appealing to a wider audience. This idea, and I say this publicly in front of all of you because someone has said this to me, oh, people will buy tickets to hear Florence Price and William Grant Still, but they're not going to buy tickets to hear Julia Perry and Ollie Wilson and George Walker. Right, this idea that we are already putting on audiences an expectation, and even that expectation goes across cultural bounds, that we make decisions for diverse cultures that we want to bring in. Homogeneity and representation, right? Going to the same kind of conversation, the fact that we think that all of these cultures as we bring them in should look the same, should sound the same, should reflect the same background. And in fact, lastly, especially as a conductor and as a programmer, accessibility. Part of the reason I started doing this work and being so passionate about this is because even as I wanted to program this music, it still was not accessible to me or to performing organizations to get their hands on this music. It wasn't published, it wasn't recorded, we could not perform it. So how is the accessibility playing a part in these numbers? Luckily, the Oakland Symphony, my new home, is a part of moving this forward. The last piece that I want to talk about as we wrap up our journey together is Julia Perry's short piece for orchestra, a piece that will open my first concert in the inaugural season with the Oakland Symphony this weekend. This piece, a short piece for orchestra, is one of the first orchestral works that we have by Julia Perry. It is a piece that she writes in 1952, shortly after she begins studying with Luigi Dalla Piccola. It was premiered by Dean Dixon in a Turin Symphony, and this was one of those pieces that traveled all throughout Europe, going on tour with the New York Philharmonic, with the Pittsburgh Symphony, and so many other top-rate orchestras. The New York Times wrote about this piece that it was rugged and powerful and had an appealing chromatic feel, filled with a lovely orchestral details. It's a piece that has grown on me. It was one of the actual pieces that had been published that I could get my hands on. And in thinking about this conversation of how do we begin to move classical music forward, it's a piece that I'm very excited to introduce to our audiences this weekend. But before I introduce them to this piece, I want to talk about three of the musical characteristics that Julia Perry uses to build this short piece for orchestra. You're going to get a first-hand look on this before our audiences on Friday. I have the score. Can you all still hear me? Fantastic, wonderful. Julia Perry, this idea that I mentioned earlier of composers taking a little bit, especially black composers taking a little bit and creating an entire world, especially this idea, and it's so important to say this, of black females throughout, black women throughout history, taking a little bit and making a lot, right? I think this is so beautifully represented in Julia Perry's music. She takes three motives and crafts this entire 8 Very simple ascending chromatic notes that go up and down throughout the piece. Often it's played as a grace note gesture. Sometimes it's slowed down. Sometimes it's also inverted. So this is the first germination that we get. The second germination that we get is a chord that she builds off of two minor thirds and a perfect chord. So we get minor third, perfect fourth. Another way to look at this chord, and another way that it shows up in the piece, is a stacking of a tritone and a major sixth. And the last piece of musical material that we get for her is this melodic contour that goes up a half step, up a fifth, down a half step, and down a fourth. And from these three pieces of musical material, she creates an entire world. I'm not going to play the entire piece for you because that's for Friday night at the concert with the Oakland Symphony. But I do want to play the opening of this so you really get a sense of the genius and the brilliance of Julia Perry and her work in creating this short piece for orchestra. You have to hear the rest on Friday. So, in conclusion, the biggest goal for me in doing this work is really trying to get across, and I've said it a couple of times here, this idea that black music is not a monolith, and especially black classical music is not a monolith. This conversation we see happening across genre lines and popular music and classical music of how do we define black music? What is black music, right? I will name drop this, Beyonce and the Cowboy Carter album, this idea of who gets the control and who gets the narrative of crafting and shaping the conversations around defining black music. Julia Perry and Irene Britton Smith, to me, are two perfect examples of continually reminding myself that we can never pigeonhole black composers. And as we fight for an equitable space in classical music, hopefully this idea of expansiveness permeates all different kinds of cultures and all different peoples who come into the space and don't feel locked into one specific perspective. How do we steward this, and how do we continue doing this work? Change does not happen in a vacuum. One of the biggest things that I saw and witnessed in 2020 and starting to do this work was sort of the sparseness of how this conversation was happening. And what is really imperative and what is really beautiful and what I'm grateful for standing here is that it will take partnerships like this one, partnerships with music academies and performing organizations and research institutions and recording companies and publishing houses and critics and journalists and audiences. We need everyone to be bought into this idea of truly fighting for equity and holding each other accountable in the space of classical music. So please join us on Friday, October 18th at the Paramount Theater in Oakland as we kick off the beginning of our season. And for me, most importantly, as we start this tenure with a piece by Julia Perry, a composer along with Irene Britton Smith, who for so long did not get their due, but I'm so grateful to be a part of the push to highlight their voices and to bring their legacies back to the public. Thank you all so much for being here, and I will take questions if you have them now. Thank you. I must have done my job really well. Yes. So the question was about the tritones. There's sort of a heavy tritone presence in the chords and in the figures that she's writing. Sort of the idea of in this first chord, you get this tritone, and even and it's something that pops up all over this floor. You know, even in that big timpani thing that comes at the end of this, the timpani ends the first section on a tritone, right? So this idea of how she takes the tritone and develop it, it's all over the score. It's sort of, and that's one of those germinations is you can take apart those three motives and find parts of those motives sort of transformed throughout the piece. So yeah, that's a big part of her work and how she takes those motives and creates this entire world out of it. Yeah.
Do you feel like it's ever quite resolved?
No, and that's one of the things of the piece. Like even the final chord, I'll give this one spoiler. The final chord of this piece ends in D question mark, right? So, right, you know, the first pitch that you get at the beginning is like as clear as possible. You're in D, and you have this tritone and these sort of intervals. And even at the end, it ends with a prevailing D chord, but a cluster filled with tritones and all of the other sort of intervals that she introduces in those first three meadows. And I think for me and Julia Perry, that is one of the beautiful things, is that a lot of her pieces, especially her instrumental work and the pieces that deal with this sort of modernist approach, never really feel resolved. They never really feel like they come to a close, and that's the thing that I find really beautiful. But a thing that critics found horrible. Like that, a lot of the critics were like, "Oh, these pieces are unfinished and they're not fully developed, and no, like, they kind of break to the close." But that was then, and this is now. Yeah.
I'm a historian and musician, so I'm kind of seeing this through ballet. But I did wonder, these two women obviously get these amazing opportunities to go to these educational institutions to write music, and so there seems like there's this big disjuncture between their opportunities to write and their opportunities for performance. And I kind of just struggle to understand that, especially given, one of them is being sent essentially by the apparatus of the American state on these cultural Cold War tours around the world to show, oh yes, America has both culture and we're not racist. It's very similar to the jazz tours that are happening at the same time. And so it feels like there's every reason to think that these institutions in the 50s and 60s would have wanted to perform this music. So it feels like, especially given that they're getting these opportunities in the educational institutions in the first place. So what's your explanation for why they don't get performed?
Yeah, this is the sort of the hard talk, the hard part of the conversation. And I think it's also reflective of what happens now. This idea that Julia Perry, primarily Irene Britton Smith as well, it's a lot of grants, it's a lot of fellowships, it's a lot of kind of external things giving them opportunities to write. But at the end of the day, there is still a male conductor that has to program your piece. And the reality is, and still the reality was and still is that was sort of the stopping point. The pieces that were recorded and published and toured by Julia Perry were really kind of a few conductors who said, "Oh, women composers are worth investing my time in doing that work, so I'm going to do it." But she names all of these conductors of people who didn't want to play her music: Zubin Mehta, Claudio Abbado, these great names, these great figures that we adore. I've had living conductors whose names I will not call, who've said to me, "Oh, I don't want to do that music; it's not good." Right, and so I think there is this conversation of who is responsible for programming this music, and sort of what are the implicit, unimplicit biases that they have around programming it. And I truly believe, and they both talk about in the book with Helen Walker, this idea of, it was composers, it was orchestras, it was sort of these programming forces that stopped giving them interest. And so you have this amazing output and all of this grant money and all of these great resources to go write the music, but then getting that translated into publishing houses, into orchestra stages, into recording houses was always the issue. There was always, for lack of better words, a man in the way of, fully allowing them to realize that.
Just to follow up on that, who were the grant makers? The Guggenheim is often, the committee is made up of previous recipients.
Yeah.
And so I think they would be the same people at some level. Are they different people? Or is it like, oh, we'll let you write, but we're not actually going to make other people listen to it? Or we'll not actually let ourselves perform it. Is it the same people, or is it different people?
From my research, it was often different people, right? And you can usually, and especially in Julia Perry, you can usually, in studying her scores, you can find where the hitch is. For example, I won't say what publishing company has the rights to her music currently, but this publishing company still today is renting her manuscripts and refuses to let people typeset these manuscripts and actually make parts that we can actually use. So all of the parts that they have published, we use them. Some of them still have mistakes. Me and my librarian went through this score and found all of the mistakes that have transferred from orchestra to orchestra to orchestra with this piece, right? So there's usually always some sort of hitch in that process when all of the entities are not the same. I think the success that she has is when she was in control of her own fate, right? When she's touring for the U.S. Information Service, she is conductor. She is in charge of that. She is leading that course. When she's in Europe, she has a lot more success. It's when she comes back to the U.S. she finds that tension, which is a common thread among Black artists, both male and female, of that time. Yes.
I was just thinking in terms of, programming, you're saying, people are okay with this kind of music, but not, with this, and that speaks to, in some cases a larger issue where people are still not comfortable with, say, what we think of as mainstream 20th century music. And as someone who really likes that music, I'm like, bring it on. But I'm wondering, if there, in terms of programming, it's, if there's an opportunity for taking some of these pieces and not doing them as the, we put them as, the token piece where it's like, and this is the piece by the black, where it's a token, not only just is it the black composer or the woman, but the 20th century piece, but if we surround it with other pieces, that fit within the 20th century, so don't put it with, Beethoven, put it with, something that reflects where people can understand that this is part of a larger context, where it doesn't become, the token anything, where it's with, Stravinsky or Hindeman or George Walker or whoever, so that it's not just sort of this isolated, this isolated thing. And that, for me, that would be a more, a way of programming with a certain amount of respect too. When you say like, hey, these are all pieces that go together, as opposed to, always saying like, we put this piece here and then we'll play the stuff that that's from a completely different tradition. We'll play some Mozart next or something. That's nothing against Mozart, but it's weird. In any program, sometimes when you have these pieces that contrast in a way that doesn't enhance them. Programming, ideally, right? You want every piece should be exciting by itself, and it should somehow build together where the whole thing feels even more exciting than the sum of its parts. So if there's, if people feel like, oh, thank God that piece was done, so I can get to the part of the program I want, as opposed to sort of creating hopefully a feeling where you're really in sort of the midst of something.
Yes. I mean, I don't often toot my own horn, but I will with this program because it's something that I really did think about, and I really did have very, deep conversations with the programming forces at the Oakland Symphony around how to open my season with this piece and program it in a way that sets it up well for our audiences, but doesn't leave it as its own sort of island. We have, 3 jazz compositions that come after the Nielsen 4. For me, that was, thinking about the expansion of jazz, and we have 3 brand new jazz composers, 3 brand new works. So that entire first half of the concert is all music that people won't know, but they will know, right? So trying to find those ways for people to have conversations, and I really think it takes having people who are just really passionate about creating those experiences, because oftentimes when you're in the thick of it and you're in the room, and I say this as someone who does this all the time, there's so many things happening and so many things going on, and in the quest to just do the good work of getting the piece on the program and having that representation, we don't often contextualize it in ways that truly prepares and sets up our audiences. So yeah, I think that is how you set these pieces up is really very important, and also how we talk about them. I did the Irene Britton Smith, the Symphonietta that I talked about. I did the premiere of that piece at the University of Colorado Boulder in 2022, and upon my own journey of creating performance editions of those parts and trying to sell that piece to people, everyone was like, Kedrick, no one's they're gonna hate this piece, do not do this, this is awful. But I believed in it, I believed in it, and I studied it, and I knew what it was harmonically, and I had to sort of be the evangelist for this piece. And I think a lot of these composers need performers, need historians, need audience members to sort of be evangelists for these composers and these works, just like there are people who trek to Bayreuth every year to be in the halls of Wagner, right? We need that same kind of dedication, totality for these composers in order to truly make some change and make some difference that sticks. Yes?
Will this wonderful program be a one-time only for those of us that cannot attend on Friday?
Sadly, this particular program is only happening on Friday, but we'll see if maybe in years to come it'll come back, or I'll sell it to some other orchestra. But this particular program will only be happening this Friday, unfortunately. Yes.
Will it be archived anywhere? YouTube or?
I don't think we have those capabilities currently, and this is one of the joys of the Oakland Symphony, is that it is live and in person, and it is sort of a one and done experience. So yeah, I think from what my understanding is that Friday the 18th is really the moment to hear this. But you know, I'm always, and I will continue to be fighting to bring more of Julia Perry and Irene Britton Smith to the Oakland Symphony and to all of the orchestras that I conduct. They all get very annoyed with me because I will not let it go. So you will definitely be seeing more of their music during my tenure with the orchestra. So we only archive recording internally, so we can't share. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Du Bois and Washington, decades after their death, do you think one was more right than the other?
What was the question? Sorry.
Du Bois and Washington, the two ideas of black social thought. Do I think one was more right than the other years later? I don't. I think they were both right. And I say this because I am always someone that loves to sit in between the tension, and I truly believe that beauty is created in between tension and in between tense conversations. I think the diversity and beauty that we have in black classical music comes because there was this opposing thought, because there were people caught in between that. One of my favorite pieces of information is that Irene Britton Smith wrote to Florence Price because they were both in Chicago, and they were having this conversation of Florence Price being someone who is much more aligned sort of in that Booker T. Washington camp, and how she takes on maintaining the history of black culture in her classical music, versus Irene Britton Smith, who very much was like, I don't want to do that. Like, that's not my goal. But they found this sort of idea of companionship and friendship and mentorship in the fact that they were both black women writing in classical music. So yeah, I personally don't think that either one of them is right. I think I think the tension of their conversation, for lack of better words, sort of the tension of the conversation of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? It's the two of them coming together to have the conversation on both sides that moves us all forward. And so I feel it that same way with Booker T. Washington and W. Du Bois, right? It takes two different approaches that are very different camps, all working for the same goal, that truly moved all of black people forward. So, yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming and spending your Monday evening with me. For those who can come, we still have tickets for the concert. It's on our website. Hope to see you all there. If not, thanks for coming.